Hello and welcome. I'm Vincent Makori.
And I'm Ndimyake, Mwakalyelye. Somalia's interim government and the international community have blamed the militant group Al-Shabaab for exacerbating the famine affecting 6 regions of the country.
The group's indiscriminate attacks on government forces, civilians and aid workers has destabilized the country and complicated efforts to deliver aid. Al-Shabaab's influence in the region was part of a recent discussion in Washington about the challenges facing Somalia.
When Al-Shabaab militants pulled out of Mogadishu in August, the interim government declared the city liberated. And Somali Prime Minister Abdiweli Mohamed Ali, in a recent interview with Voice of America, suggested the threat from Al-Shabaab is manageable.
Al-Shabaab is still a threat because they occupy some parts of the country, especially southern part of the country. So still they are a threat, but it's a threat that we are ready to deal with.
But this week's suicide bombing in Mogadishu indicates the contrary. Al-Shabaab continues its attacks despite the presence of the African Union mission in Somalia, or AMISOM, there to keep peace. The militants' unpredictable attacks have disrupted efforts by some donor agencies to provide food and other basic supplies to people afflicted by the famine. Many have labelled the transitional federal government of Sheikh Sharif Sheikh Ahmed, which only controls pockets of the country, ineffective in its efforts to run the country or address the famine. While many agree that Somalia needs more support to bring peace and stability, there is disagreement over what kind of support can be offered. This is former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Jendai Fraser, who served under former U.S. President George W. Bush.
You can't end this famine and future famines until you impose a military solution in Somalia. That is a military solution that has legitimacy through good governance. I don't see instability and insecurity as a way to ultimately resolve the cyclic drought and then man-made famine that comes because of the instability.
But E.J. Hogendoon of the International Crisis Group disagrees, citing the backlash against the United States and Ethiopia during prior attempts to provide military and humanitarian support to Somalia.
I think that were you to do so, you would face very similar dynamics to what the U.S. faced in 1993 or what the Ethiopians faced in 2006 to 2009. And I think it could get very messy very quickly.
Fraser and Hogendoon stress that the solution ultimately has to come from the citizens of Somalia. They cite the autonomous regions of Somaliland and Puntland within Somalia which have achieved peace. However, acknowledging the complexity of Somalia's social makeup, Fraser says all options should be considered.
You have to engage all stakeholders, local administration, clan elders, civil society, even if necessary, the Shabaab. I'm not saying fund them, but I'm talking about Shabaab now, but I am saying dialogue with them to the degree that you can break and split and divide Al-Shabaab, all the better.
But Director Sophia Tesfa-Mariam of the U.S. Foundation for the Horn of Africa says she opposes a military solution in Somalia and says Fraser's point to engage all parties is late.
If she had the same attitude in 2006 as she had today, where she welcomed all parties in Somalia, including Al-Shabaab, we wouldn't have the story that we're having today about Somalia. But she categorically rejected all groups except the TFG, and that's what created the chaos that we have today.
Hogendoon agrees that dialogue with Al-Shabaab is necessary, considering the amount of territory they control in Somalia. He also urges the U.S. administration and other players to broaden the discussion of Somalia's future beyond the TFG and even take a page from the now dissolved Islamic Courts Union, which essentially ran the country before the TFG took over.
The Islamic Courts Union was essentially kind of a homegrown system of governance. And that system, like it or not, worked in the Somali context, where this to some degree dealt with these concerns that clans had that any one single clan is going to be able to dominate us. And very quickly, with a variety of carrots and sticks, you reached a tipping point, and within 6 months, you saw the Islamic Courts Union essentially expand its influence throughout all of South and Central Somalia and impose an unprecedented amount of peace and security in that area.
Now, joining us in the studio with more perspective on addressing famine in Somalia is Harun Maruf, Senior Editor in the VOA Somali Service. Thank you so much for joining us again, Harun. So what do you make, first of all, just the overall positions of the guests that we just introduced?
Well, the question regarding military intervention in Somalia, my interpretation is that not necessarily to impose military to fight other Somalis, but a military that gives the peace and the Somali government a space to work. A good example is what the African Union troops achieved in Somalia. Mogadishu, they are protecting the government, but also they have given space for humanitarian aid to operate and reach people who are in need. Hundreds, thousands of people came to Mogadishu, and that's why we are able to feed them today. So to bring more troops into Somalia, to give the government and peace to operate and expand their space, their territorial control, that would massively help with the humanitarian situation. But also to take these troops from Mogadishu. They are concentrating on Mogadishu. Mogadishu is very volatile, hostile city. All the politicians are there. It's very crowded city because of the competition to power and resources.
Absolutely.
Go to other regions in the south, like Lower Chuba, Bakbai and Bokol, and establish some presence for the international community there. And those areas, the people who live in those areas, would be more hospitable to international intervention.
Are you, because those are the areas that you just mentioned where the famine has been declared the most, and that's where Al-Shabaab is very heavily operating. So how do you see this kind of reconciliation between peacekeeping forces and Al-Shabaab? And also adding to that this suggestion that maybe the Al-Shabaab should be engaged in some kind of dialogue. Do you see that as a possibility?
There are 4 blocks within Al-Shabaab, the normal sympathizers and another group which are less rigid ideologically. But 2 other blocks, the foreign jihadists and Somalis who fought in Afghanistan, who are very susceptible to the global jihadism, it will be very difficult to negotiate with them. And they are the key decision makers. So you will always have to ask yourselves, you can get 1 or 2 persons from Al-Shabaab or this fragment or a splinter group. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult to speak and to engage with the leadership of Al-Shabaab, those key leaders. So the best hope is to compete with Al-Shabaab in terms of the hearts and minds of the people, give them a space, give them areas where the people can come and operate, make the government more credible, fight corruption, but also the international community must really commit themselves truly. They are not heavily committed in Somalia.
They're not heavily committed. In fact, that's one of the points that was raised.
Either.
And we've run out of time. It's such a long topic, but we hope to have you back to tell us more. Thank you so much. Harun Maruf is the senior editor of the VOA Somali service.